Picture this. It is 2050, and together we have built a climate-neutral society. Solar and wind energy has replaced fossil fuels. Our cars, buildings and factories use clean energy, and we breathe clean air. New jobs have come with modernisation and green technologies. Our cities are greener, and we are better prepared for heat waves and floods. Our forests and natural areas have grown, and wildlife has flourished. We've averted the worst of the climate crisis. We are back on track. Sounds too good to be true? In Europe, we are convinced it's possible. If we start now, we can make it. In Europe, we have a plan, the European Green Deal, to become climate neutral and to grow our economy. At the COP26 in Glasgow, we will call on the world to raise ambition and take action that will lead us to a better future.
Good morning, everybody, and a warm welcome to this event, to all of you joining us today. The European Commission representation in Ireland, together with European Movement Ireland, is delighted to host this event, reflecting on the outcome of the COP26 conference that just finished earlier this week. Over the past few weeks, of course, COP26 has dominated the headlines, putting the spotlight on how the global community is responding to climate change. The EU and its member states took part, of course, in COP26 as parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. But now that the summit has concluded, we want to look together at the outcome and what next. This is really the purpose of our event today. As you all know, and as you saw in the clip, the goal is to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, stated firmly at the opening of COP26 that it is our duty to act now. Europe, with its Green Deal, is determined to spare no effort to become a climate neutral continent. But we must obviously speed up our efforts and our action in order to do that. Setting a target only has real meaning if it is backed up with concrete policies that will achieve the target. And that's why earlier this year, as you saw, the EU proposed to put into law the goal for Europe to become climate neutral by 2050. As well as the target to reduce net greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030. And we have also proposed a package of measures that would get us there. So in this sense, I think it's fair to say that the EU is leading from the front. Now we look at the COP results, and they have been described by some as disappointing, and indeed even worse terms have been used. I think you have all been following the debate in the media. But I think, it's important to remember that the structure of the conference means that progress can only advance at the pace of the least enthusiastic country. That is the way the UN system works to some extent. So everybody has to agree on what the outcome is. But I think we shouldn't focus too much, I think, on what wasn't achieved, in that there were many things that were achieved and many gains. The final text, for example, contains a reference to coal for the first time in any COP agreement. Even if the original reference to phase out has been watered down to phase down at the 11th hour at the request of certain countries, I think it is an important signal for the future. The EU-US agreement to cut methane gas emissions by 30% by 2030 is another, I think, very important step forward. The US-China agreement to cooperate on climate issues is also, I think, a huge signal for the future. And of course, we have the 1 billion funding for the Global Forests Financing Pledge. But I think maybe the biggest success of the COP26 has been to focus public attention on climate issues and the urgent need to save the planet. I mean, focus the public, the global public on this. And, you know, climate neutrality, or the goal of climate neutrality, has kind of become now the new normal in terms of how we look at this issue and how we talk about this issue going forward. President von der Leyen said that the results from COP26 were a step in the right direction, and that 1.5 degrees Celsius remains within reach, but the work is far from done. But I mean, she highlighted that at least we could do now. The least we could do now was to implement the promises of Glasgow as rapidly as possible, and then aim higher. So what the COP has also done, I think, has sent a clear message that the time is up for fossil fuel subsidies and unabated reliance on coal. And these are, you know, huge step forwards compared with the past. And if all the long-term commitments announced in Glasgow are implemented, we should be able to keep global warming under 2 degrees. But of course, we need to go further. We need to do the heavy lifting and the hard work now, so that next year's COP in Egypt puts us firmly back on track for this goal of 1.5. So today we're going to reflect on the progress made at the COP and discuss the next steps. And I'm delighted to be joined by two experts on climate issues. First of all, I'd like to introduce my colleague from the European Commission's Climate Action Directorate-General, Elina Bardram. Elina is the acting director responsible for international mainstreaming and policy coordination in DG Climate Action. Also joining us today on the panel is Mari Donnelly, who is the chairperson of Ireland's Climate Change Advisory Council. Mari was previously a director in the Energy Directorate-General of the European Commission, where she was responsible for renewables, energy efficiency and innovation. They're going to speak for about 15 minutes, and after they've finished, we will have quite a lot of time, we hope, where I can put questions from you to them, and your questions can be submitted to events@europeanmovement, all one word, .ie. events@europeanmovement.ie. We do encourage all attendees to join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtags hashtag EU@COP26, all one word, and hashtag EU Green Deal, all one word. So when tweeting, please use the handles at EU Ireland and at EMI Ireland. Sorry, that's a lot for you to take in, but I think you will probably find all these hashtags available to you in the invitation. So can I, without further ado, I'd like to turn to Elina Bardram to invite her to speak. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Barbara, and good morning to everyone. It's always a bit of a kind of moment of valley of despair coming back from these COPs, but I think it's very much related to the sleep deprivation, the long hours, and kind of the need to take stock of what was actually achieved in the cold light of the day. And I think what Barbara has said in terms of a step in the right direction could not be more right. At the start of the conference, we as the EU set ourselves 3 objectives. First, we wanted to put sufficient pressure on other parties to step up their commitments to cut emissions within this decade, so by 2030, with a view to keep the 1.5 degrees goal within reach. Secondly, we wanted to reassure our developing country partners, the countries most vulnerable to the negative consequences of climate change, that donors remain committed to global solidarity and reaching the target of $100 billion per year through to 2025. And thirdly, and very importantly, we wanted to make progress on completing the rulebook, which enables a transparent and predictable implementation of Paris Agreement by all parties. And I think it's fair to say that we have made good progress on all these three objectives. To start off with, I'd like to recall that under Paris Agreement, the 195 countries that are signatories to it set a target to keep average global temperature change well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts towards 1.5 degrees. And this was based on the latest available science in 2015. Now, since that, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has become more precise in what the consequences or the additional consequences in the range between 1.5 and 2 degrees are. And indeed, all evidence points that this is going to result in rather severe and dramatic consequences. So 1.5 degrees has become more than an aspirational goal. And I think that's something that you can see in the Glasgow Pact decision. And based on current national policies, and this is what was submitted to the UNFCCC by the 12th of October, the synthesis report published by the UNFCCC pointed at 2.7 degrees global warming by the end of the century. Based on the announcements that were made during the conference or right before the conference, and assuming they are all realized, experts now estimate that we are on a path to between 1.8 and 2.4 degrees centigrade of global warming. In the COP conclusions, the parties have now agreed to revisit their commitments as necessary by the end of next year, with a view of putting us on track to 1.5 degree warming. This would maintain the upper end of ambition, which was stipulated and enshrined in the Paris Agreement. Of course, it's clear that we need further clarity on some of the pledges. Even that of the US doesn't have policies and measures attached to it, and there is absolutely no room for complacency. But it is very encouraging that most countries' positions have shifted significantly since the last COP in Madrid 2 years ago, with the announcement of many climate neutrality commitments. And with climate neutrality commitments, we're talking about the net zero targets by 2050, in the case of China by 2060, and in the case of India by 2070. But considering the different starting points of these countries, I think it's clear that the trend and the realization of net zero being the new reality for the globe has sunk in. And looking ahead, we can say that we've left Glasgow with a clear collective resolve to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. So 1.5 has become the new 2 degrees. The COP26 also completed the technical negotiations on the so-called Paris Agreement rulebook, which fixes the transparency and reporting requirements for all parties so that we can track progress against the emission reduction targets. Because if you look at it, the announcements in themselves don't deliver anything. It is the policies, measures, the actual implementation that happens at the level of nation states, locally, that makes the difference. Announcements, pledges, as good as they are just articulation of intent. So follow through and follow up will be absolutely critical. The Paris rulebook, the transparency framework, also includes Article 6 mechanisms, which set out the functioning of international carbon markets, carbon pricing, which will support further global cooperation on emissions reductions. Countries have to put in place their domestic frameworks in order to deliver the commitments made. As regards this global solidarity aspect, one of the 3 objectives that I was referring to in the beginning, on climate finance, the agreement text commits developed countries to double their collective contribution to adaptation finance from 2019 levels by 2025, and to reach the 100 billion goal as soon as possible. Parties also commit to process to agree long-term climate finance beyond 2025. As you know, the Paris Agreement extended the Copenhagen commitment of 100 billion up to 2025. The COP also decided to establish a dialogue between parties, stakeholders, and relevant organizations to support efforts to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage associated with climate change. This builds from the so-called Santiago process, which is intended to raise awareness, but also raise preparedness to deal with the unavoidable consequences of climate change. Now, well, some may say that a Glasgow Agreement or the Glasgow Climate Pact is by no means sufficient to limit global warming and to avoid the worst consequences. But it's clear that progress has been made. The EU absolutely agrees that this decade, up to 2030, is going to be decisive for the successful implementation of Paris Agreement and for our collective efforts. We still need many major emitters to cut their emissions further and faster if we are to stay within the reach of 1.5 degrees. What we have set out is an accelerated process in this regard. The parties will have to review their nationally determined contributions in line with what science tells us in view of making further progress by the end of 2022. This is clearly stipulated in the deal. And next year, with the Egyptian COP presidency, when we convene in Sharm el-Sheikh, there will be the first ever ministerial high-level roundtable to assess pre-2030 ambition in light of science and to look at what further steps might be taken within this decade to address the mitigation gap. We, as the Union, will need to be also prepared to explain very clearly how our minus 55% reduction target corresponds with our long-term strategy, which is the net zero by 2050, and with the 1.5 degrees. So that is what we will be expecting from all the other parties. And I do think that when we look at these nationally determined targets in that overall framework, we will collectively find more space for ambition. The UN Secretary-General has also been, by the Glasgow Pact decision, invited to consider organizing a leaders summit in 2023 that would focus on the Paris Agreement goals, but not just mitigation, also looking at adaptation and finance, which are equally important in making progress. The EU is doing its part. I think with the climate law, we have made the at least 55% reduction target a part of EU legislation, and it is fully legally binding. And the package of our ambitious proposals adopted this July on climate and energy reforms charts the course for achieving those aims. In a manner of speaking, when I was saying that many partners still need to follow up with policies and measures, we will be able to provide ideas, experience, and expertise for them to design the policy packages that capture the whole of economy approach and really reflect the transformative need for reform in the way we do business, in the way we consume, and in the way we produce. It is clear that others must act. EU's share is some 8% of global emissions, compared to the Chinese third of global emissions. And while we will continue to share our policy experience and assert pressure on all major economies to follow through on their promises, go further on coal and fossil fuel subsidies, it is clear that the government's own determination will never be replaced by the pressure that's put on them by external partners. So highest possible level of ambition needs to be internalized by the central governments, by the prime minister's offices, by the budget planners and investors in order for the 1.5 to be a viable target. The test of the initial pledges will be how quickly and effectively they can be translated into action. I'd maybe say one word about how we engaged in the negotiations. In the last months and right up to the conclusions of the conference, the EU carried out extensive outreach. We organized numerous bilateral meetings with different groups at different levels, The executive vice president himself embarked on a very ambitious travel scheme, visiting countries from Antigua to Barbuda to Indonesia, India, China, different partners that could play a role in brokering the deal. The conversations with US, India and China at the end of the conference are a clear manifestation of the trust that has been building throughout the months and weeks and days ahead of the conference. At the COP26 itself, EU and its partners engaged in tireless efforts to find the compromises necessary and to bring the whole deal across the finishing line. Not just the EVP, but also numerous EU ministers personally facilitated the negotiations on the most complicated topics, such as adaptation, such as finance, such as the ambition, how do we capture the 1.5 degrees in science, and they worked into small hours throughout the second week. The EU actions were really key to seal the deal, and the timely interventions by EVP Timmermans in the plenary, which kind of changed the tone of the whole debate, going from, okay, this is my ask, to kind of saying, okay, collectively, how can we arrive at a compromise that's not going to be perfect for anyone, but good enough for us to continue our efforts. And we also played a central role in designing the ambitious rules for carbon markets, transparency in particular, climate finance, and the very important provisions on loss and damage. I'm really proud to say that our negotiating team, because we have been walking the talk, we also know what can realistically be put into something like the rulebook in order to allow for monitoring and verification reporting regime that has robustness, credibility, and yet is not overly burdensome for those countries who are starting off fresh. Now, much has been said about the phase down, phase out, and the so-called China and India watering down of the agreement at the very last minute. But I think it's very important to note that the COP26 presidency, Alok Sharma and his team, they listened to all parties throughout the negotiations, but also in the months, even the years ahead of the COP. And they gave utmost consideration to the diverging interests. Of course, we would have preferred, as the EU, the earlier wording that was stronger on coal, but the EU wanted to ensure the deal. And to be quite honest, if we consider this against the backdrop of the very, very complicated negotiations with the G20, just the weekend before we started the COP, I, at least, following both processes, never thought that we would have coal and fossil fuel subsidies language even survive in the decision text. It is a first for any multilateral, truly inclusive process to make reference to coal phase down or the transition away from fossil fuels. So overall, I think this has been a tiring, very exhausting process. Hard work, hard hours have been invested into the process by all the stakeholders, and it's needless to say that there were difficult moments. I don't think it is realistic to expect that the COP, which is a political moment of multilateral actors, is going to overnight change where we're heading in the future. But it is a very important mechanism to maintain the pressure, to keep the political spotlight on governments and also other stakeholders. And maybe to finish off, I'd just like to mention some of the announcements outside of the EU's climate target that were made during the COP and which also contribute to this. Firstly, the EU and US launched the global methane pledge, which Barbara has already referred to. We have over 100 countries that represent about 70% of global economy and almost half of anthropogenic methane emissions committed to a collective goal of reducing global methane emissions by at least 30% from 2020 levels by 2030. Some estimations say that this is about 0.0105, so half a tenth of a degree contribution only on its own to the reduced temperature increase. And the EU has pledged 1 billion over 5 years to support the Global Forest Finance Pledge, which totals now 12 billion in donations from public and private donors. More than 100 world leaders, representing about 85% of the world's forests, promised to end and reverse deforestation by 2030. Also, together, the European Union, with South Africa, France, Germany, and United Kingdom, United States, launched the so-called Just Energy Transition Partnership with South Africa. The partnership will accelerate the decarbonization of South Africa's economy with focus on the electricity system. With the initial commitment of $8.5 billion for the first phase of financing it, we're really making an effort to get rid of coal, transition away from coal in South Africa. And we hope that this model of financial mobilization can serve as a blueprint for other coal-dependent countries. The EU also announced a donation of 100 million euros to the UN Adaptation Fund, which makes us the biggest contributor to the total record of 351 million euros, which was kind of mobilized during the COP. We also launched the EU Catalyst Partnership, a partnership between Commission, European Investment Bank, and Breakthrough Energy. EU Catalyst Partnership is intended to mobilize up to 820 million between 2022 and 2026 to accelerate the deployment and rapid commercialization of innovative technologies. And it will thereby help the European Green Deal ambitions and the achievement of the EU's 2030 target. Each euro of public funds is expected to leverage 3 euros of private funds, and investments will be directed towards a portfolio of EU-based projects. There was a plethora of other declarations and announcements that the EU supported, ranging from the Just Transition to High Ambition Coalition to the Glasgow Breakthrough on Technologies, etc. And we feel that the momentum around the non-state engagement is really gaining force. And we really need to also focus, as the Commission, more efforts to channeling that enthusiasm in a structured way, so that also the businesses, the investors, etc., can be truly held accountable for their efforts and can be credited for their efforts. Because while we progress on our climate goals, there will also be questions about greenwashing. And as the Union, we need to remain vigilant and credible. I will stop there, and I look forward to the question and answer session, as well as the presentation that is to follow by Marie. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Elina. Thank you for a very comprehensive overview, particularly of how the Commission has operated in the whole COP26 context. And now I hand over to Mari Donnelly, who, as I mentioned, is the chair of the climate. Mari, what are you exactly again? Sorry, it's gone out of my head. Your microphone, sorry.
Oh.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes, it's called the Climate Change Advisory Council. And thank you very much indeed, Barbara, for that introduction, and indeed the opportunity to have a conversation with you today about COP26. COP26, I have to say, took place in Glasgow, and for the days that I was there, it didn't rain. So I think that is an indication of climate change in practice in the Northern Hemisphere. And as Elina has said, there was actually an agreement out of COP26. Just imagine how depressed we all would be this morning if there hadn't been, if it had collapsed. And even though it perhaps didn't reach the gold standard that many of us would have wished for, we do have a deal. We have very significant improvements in some of the mechanics, and indeed Elina has pointed those to us, carbon markets and some of the rulebook issues that are there. And it does provide us, as a consequence, with building blocks going forward. So in the case of glass half full, half empty, I think we're in a half full space, but clearly we are not in a position to rest on our laurels. And in terms of going forward, I'd like to maybe identify 3 areas that I see as areas of concern that perhaps we need to think about if we're going to be able to go forward in a successful way over the next number of years. And the first issue that I have as a point of concern is that COP is a multilateral forum. And as you quite rightly say, it operates at the speed of the slowest step. But the difficulty is that multilateral fora, as such, have lost a lot of their impact over the last number of years. I would go further and say that confidence in multilateral fora has been badly broken over the last number of years. And we are now in a situation where there is not sufficient confidence in the fora and its mechanisms to allow us to take the ambitious steps and agreements that we need in the area of climate change. And some of the reasons for this are quite obvious. I won't mention the first and most obvious one, but a second one is, if you look at how the distribution of COVID vaccines has happened, it's been primarily in the developed world, and the developing countries, are in second place in that sense and feel it very strongly. Secondly, the extent to which the global economy is rebounding out of the pandemic. Again, it's very unbalanced between developed countries and developing countries. The pledge made earlier on for 100 billion by 2020 has not been achieved. And now we're talking about 2025. So, it does undermine confidence of the developing countries and also their capability to commit to ambitious climate objectives. And I would say, as a final issue in this context, is the blatant display of power by large entities within the multilateral fora at the last minute does nothing to enhance a sense of confidence in multilateralism and the possibilities that can be achieved out of multilateralism. And I think that is a thing that we have to think very carefully about. We have a global problem. This is an issue that faces everybody in the world. And if we don't all pull together in this area, we will not be able to succeed. So for me, going forward, one of the questions that we have to think about is, how do we ensure a restoration of confidence in the multilateral process? The second illustration, if I could say, of that is the extent to which, in the absence of multilateral effectiveness, we now find ourselves in a situation of multitudinous bilateral agreements. And this isn't a complete list by any means, but firstly, we have the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People, and by the way, Ireland has joined that now. We have Beyond Coal and Gas Alliance, but significant that none of the major producers of either coal or gas are signatories to that. We have the Global Methane Pledge, and that's an important area, and Ireland is a signatory in that space, as indeed we are to the Beyond Coal and Gas Alliance. We have activities such as the Powering Past Coal Alliance, been in place for many, many years, and perhaps illustrative of how some of these bilateral pledges can actually develop and deliver results over time, in that after many years of work in that space, the word coal is now there in the final text. We have the Global Forest Finance Pledge, another one. So I could go on, and indeed Elina has listed a number of them as well. In the absence of being able to move forward in a multilateral space, those who want to move are doing it in a bilateral space. However, the difficulty is that these bilateral agreements, pledges, alliances, don't have rules, don't have metrics to measure achievements to them. Even the Methane pledge, which has a pledge of 30% by 2030, it doesn't assign allocations to the participants or the signatories. it's a pledge. It's out there, but we're not able to measure it. We're not able to monitor it. We're not able to monitor to the extent to which it's actually being delivered. So in that sense, it reinforces the concern that I have and that I've expressed, which is that we have got to get the multilateral activity and confidence back on track if we're going to succeed going forward into the future. And a second area then, of course, you know, money talks, money makes the world go around, and money is very important in this exercise as well. And one of the big headlines that came out of Glasgow was the financial pledge, the commitment of the financial institutions of $130 billion in this space. And I don't want to be too cynical, but you know, when we talk about $130 billion, that is what their assets are. That is not what they are planning to spend. And indeed, within that pledge, there is no indication and no rules that will tell us how much these entities are spending on continued exploration and extraction of fossil fuels. So on the one hand, yes, we have the big number and it sounds very impressive, but we need to go behind the number to understand exactly what is involved. What are the rules that these investors will follow, and how transparent will they be in terms of what they're actually spending money on? Because in the end of the day, as the IEA has said, we have to stop the exploration and extraction of new oil and gas if we have any possibility of maintaining our target of 1.5 degrees temperature increase. So that was a second area that, you know, I think we have to be able to go behind the pledges, behind the headlines, and understand exactly what's involved. And, you know, marketing measures will not cut the cake in this in terms of delivering results. And a third area that's very evident out of the COP26 was the defense of economic growth and ultimately trade. And this was manifested in a number of ways. Within the COP measurements, we do have a little bit of historic reality to deal with, in that on the one hand, we measure emissions at the source, at the supply end, in some cases, and for some kinds of products. And then for others, we measure it at the consumer end. And this is a little bit of an imbalance in terms of understanding how the whole process works. And for many countries who are at the source of fossil fuels, and I do emphasize fossil fuels to a very high level because, you know, it's almost 80% of our emissions. So in the end of the day, if we don't get fossil fuels right, we cannot achieve success in this space. So for those who produce the fossil fuels, the preference is to rely on reducing demand in the consumption parts of the world, and that ultimately then they would respond to that, as opposed to counting emissions at the source, which we do, for example, in the area of methane. So that's an issue that I think we have to think about in terms of balance of economic growth and ultimately trade. And if I take coal specifically, this is an area where economic development had premier position over climate in a number of instances. And it was, and whilst it's legitimate for developing countries to want to develop, and of course we should support them in that way, using coal as the mechanism, given that we have so many new technologies and green technologies that in fact are actually cheaper in this space, it doesn't seem to make sense that we are still defending coal for the support of developing nations in order to get, you know, reduce their poverty, to allow economic development and improve the health and well-being of their society. And perhaps the most visible aspect of this comes in the space of subsidies, because that's really what is supporting trade. And this brings me to perhaps one of the pivotal issues I see in COP26 and ultimately going forward our challenges in this climate space. And that is the necessity of linking trade and climate action together. We cannot continue to have these in two separate boxes. We talk about, whole of government response to climate action here in Ireland, for example, but equally we need a whole of global institution response to this challenge. We need not just the COP, the UNFCCC activity on the one hand, we also need WTO and the trade side coming together in order to bring about a successful outcome here. Now, we have, of course, and Elina mentioned this, the US-China co-sponsorship of the WTO's discussions on greening. And that's very positive. Unfortunately, no targets, no constraints. And, we're still in discussions to what actually it means. We have the EU-US discussions now on sectoral decarbonisation, for example, in steel and aluminium. And that's very positive. And I think that's potentially a way to go forward into the future. And I have to say that there was quite a bit of discussion at COP26 about the EU's proposal for the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Many felt it was climate colonialism, but it does point to the awareness of some of the exporting nations who sell into the European market, and they're concerned that if and when the day comes, the carbon content of their products and their production methodologies is actually analysed, that they may actually come up short and ultimately be covered by this mechanism. So again, these are the tools and techniques that I believe are very important, and I emphasise them because one of the major strengths of the European Union is trade. We trade obviously within ourselves, but we trade globally, and we are a major purchaser on the global market. And we have the possibility of using our trade instruments along with our climate ambitions to bring about a real result in the space of climate action across our partners throughout the world. So that would lead me to the situation that would say, let's put together our climate ambition and our trade tools and techniques and see whether we can't deliver a real result out of that. In the end of the day, what are we trying to achieve? What we want to have is, we want to have clean production and clean consumption so that we have a better environment, we have a cleaner environment, a healthier environment, and we prevent global warming. That means we have got to reduce the fossil fuels in our production side and ultimately in our consumption side as well, where it applies. It means we have to fundamentally increase the rate of innovation and the rate of diffusion of innovation and share those innovations with all partners in this exercise so that we can all benefit. And some of you might have heard me say before, in the end of the day, our first and most effective tool is energy efficiency, because the energy you don't use is the cheapest and the cleanest energy that is available to us today. So that's a few comments and a few thoughts arising out of my visit to COP26 and looking at the outcome of that exercise. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mari. And I think we have a lot of valuable food for thought there from both of our speakers. So now it's your turn. It's over to you with your questions, and I see they're beginning to come in. So perhaps I'll start with one concerning developed countries and vulnerable nations. How can developed countries mobilize climate finance to vulnerable nations effectively? Maybe, Elina, would you like to comment in reply to that question?
Sure, I'll be happy to give it a stab. I think it's one of those questions we clearly fell short of mobilizing the 100 billion by 2020, which was the pledge already stemming from Copenhagen. I think that also shows that it is not so easy. There are questions of absorption capacity, there are questions of project pipeline, there is all kinds of issues relating to what is counted towards that 100 billion. And we need to be credible there. So we can't label every single investment that goes towards infrastructure or energy as something that belongs to that 100 billion. I think one of the things that developed countries can do is to start their programming, start the kind of assistance in the context of climate finance, but in the broader context of ODA as well, on the basis of the nationally determined contributions that the developing countries have now also put in place, which is basically a blueprint of how that country intends to achieve the 2030 targets that they have communicated under the Paris Agreement, and identify among those priorities the priorities that fit for the 1.5 pathway. Within the EU, we have, of course, made 35% of our budget for the next 7 years about climate. It has to directly contribute to the climate goals. And we apply something that's called the do no significant harm principle, which means that every penny spent from the EU budget has to be compatible with Paris. So it cannot be harmful or result in a further investment to carbon-rich industry or fossil fuels, which would ultimately lead to stranded assets and lock in for too long a time. So taking the government's own NDC plans, nationally determined contribution plans, as a blueprint for engagement, assisting building capacity for development of the project pipelines for viable projects, and also using public money as catalyst and element for de-risking projects in the low carbon technologies, etc. So, and leveraging in private investment, because there is no way that ODA type of funds are ever going to match the requirements that we have, which are in the region of trillions. So having that kind of clarity of what you can do with ODA is also important in view of being honest to our partner countries. One thing that I will still mention in this is the accent on the so-called 2.1c article of the Paris Agreement, which is all about enabling environments. We also need to insist that the host governments, the developing country governments, assume responsibility for their own development in ways that allows us to have predictability and regulatory certainty for the interested investors that would be coming into that specific country to help in the green transition. I'll stop there. There's books that could be written about this topic, and needless to say, we as donors have not cracked it yet. Thanks.
Thank you, Elina. A question maybe more so for Mari about Ireland and how it is going to reach these goals and play its role in the climate action agenda. I mean, we saw that Ireland was very supportive of many of the initiatives that were launched at COP26. So it's a big ask now to actually meet all these commitments. Mari, how would you like to comment on that?
Well, I think it's fair to say that firstly, Ireland is signatory to the Paris Agreement. We're also a member of the EU, so these are our international commitments that we have bought into and that we are working to meet. And I think it's fair to say that the legislation that was adopted in July of this year is an illustration of the commitment of the country to playing its part in terms of living up to its international requirements. But of course, it's not just international requirements. We do this as much for ourselves, if I can be very selfish about it, because ultimately the measures that we're talking about in terms of climate action will benefit us as citizens in the country. You know, it will improve our air quality and reduce a lot of the, respiratory illnesses, and COVID is particularly relevant, obviously, to have that. It improves our water quality, and that's something that, of course, is very important for us as individuals. It greens our cities, greens our spaces, and enhances the sustainability of our economy going forward. So these are the kinds of things that we need to do. And at COP, Ireland, as I say, joins the High Ambition Coalition, signed into a number of the pledges, the Beyond Oil and Gas, which in fact we already have in place in Ireland. It also signed the Methane Pledge. And that's actually one where Ireland will need to work with other colleagues in that space because, as you know, unlike the average, where the average is fossil fuel emissions represent about 80% of emissions, in Ireland, the methane represents, 35% of our emissions. So we have a very different profile in Ireland to what you have in other countries in Europe and indeed other countries internationally. And as a consequence, this means that we have to look at what are the areas of action that we can take. And I think it's very interesting to look at what the American paper, because they already had a paper for this, what their actions are. And quite rightly, more than half of their paper is dedicated to reducing methane from both the exploration and extraction of fossil fuels, oil and gas. This makes sense because, firstly, it's cost effective to do it. So you have to ask why it hasn't been done before, but it's cost effective. And it is 35% to 40% of the methane emissions of the world. So almost at the stroke of a pen, you could have a really dramatic change there. They're also focused on emissions from their waste, landfills and other sources such as that. Again, areas where Ireland has already put a lot of effort into this, and we are making good successes and strides in that area. And in the agricultural space, they're very much focused on manure management, slurry, And in Ireland, for example, we've already started this process of LESS, which is low emission slurry spreading, for example. So in this space, there will be challenges going forward. That's absolutely for sure. But I think it's fair to say that in Ireland, we have a framework now, we have a procedure, we have a plan. The real challenge, the important challenge is, can we implement the actions so that we can deliver the results? And this is the challenge that we will face in Ireland, but it's also the challenge that other countries are facing vis-a-vis the commitments that they have made in COP26.
Thank you very much, Mari. A question maybe for both of you, which would be, the EU has set a very ambitious program, targets, etc. I mean, is there a risk that the EU becomes a mug in this game, in that it goes very, very far, and if other blocs don't follow, they steal a competitive advantage from the EU. We lose out economically. I mean, I'm playing devil's advocate here to some extent, but I think, it is a legitimate question that, there's huge investment and huge efforts on the EU side. And if they're not matched by other blocs in the world, where do we all wind up? Maybe I'll start with you, Elina, on that, please.
Sure thing, Barbara. And I'm grinning a little bit because it sounds like it's a question from 5 years ago, quite frankly. I think it's plain for anyone who looks at the transition to low carbon economy, to net zero economy, is already well underway. Like what we see in the prices of renewables, them actually not only coming at par with fossil fuel energy, but being much more cost effective today is something that our modelers who do the projections for future have been really struggling to catch up with. The change of transformation, the pace of transformation is quicker than anticipated. And what we've seen in context of solar technologies, etc., the scaling up of those has taken all of us by a little bit of a surprise. So the question to me is not, whether or not we will be ahead of the curve. It's soon going to be whether we're going to be behind the curve, as others are investing to research and development at, frankly, a higher percentage than we are. So we need to be very, very determined and decisive to keep our position in the new net zero economy. So, and that's why the Horizon Europe and all kinds of different instruments that are intended to catalyze and facilitate de-risking and putting money into new technologies are so very important. So for EU to remain relevant and competitive we actually have no choice. So it is not a question of being ahead, but it's about not being left behind today. Thanks.
Thank you. Mari, would you like to come in on that?
Well, I think that, the main issue here, and again, I would absolutely share Elena's view, that this is a transformation. This is an industrial revolution equivalent. And if I take it just from an Irish perspective, going down the route of sustainability means we use the circular economy, we use natural resources, we use sustainable resources. And we are very, very fortunate in Ireland because we have the natural resources. We have wind, and despite the fact that some people will contradict this, we do have solar possibilities in Ireland. We have hydro, we have marine. So we have the necessary ingredients to drive this shift in our economy into sustainability. It's a wonderful opportunity using the natural resources and our human capital, of which we do benefit enormously in this country. Combining those two allows us to firstly develop, put in place, and then illustrate to the rest of the world what a sustainable society and economy looks like. And I believe that's the real opportunity. And we talk about growth in GDP. It's not so much growth in GDP, but that's where the well-being growth comes from. And I believe that's a possibility that we really can achieve in Ireland. We can achieve it also across the EU, of course.
Thank you very much. Now, I think we take one last question before wrapping up, and it's, I think, a very important one about, our governments, institutions, and the COP community paying enough attention to communicating with the public to ensure, social acceptance and, implementation of commitments at the individual and local levels. And I mean, sometimes the COP came across very much as a hermetically sealed world all of its own. When one was reading the media coverage of it, that it was, a whole, how would I say, a little world, as I said, on its own. Obviously, social acceptance is extremely important, particularly for some of the harder actions that have to be implemented. Maybe I'll start with you, Mari, on that, social acceptance.
It's we've talked about this before. We can have all of the innovation that is possible. We can have all of the new technologies that's possible. We can have the capacity to use those. We can throw money at it. We can have policies from government. But in the end of the day, if this activity doesn't engage the hearts and minds of people, it will not succeed. And I do have a concern that much of what we talk about coming out of COP is, shall we say, a negative message, potentially even a frightening message. And whilst that's relevant and it's true and the science is there to demonstrate that, I think what we have to do is to translate the action that's necessary into understandable bite-sized pieces that are relevant to people's daily lives. And to make it possible through government policies and government support, make it possible for people to make the right choices that they want to make, but they can't make in the absence of the necessary supports and policies in place. And that's why, if I take specifically Ireland, I think the Climate Action Plan and the measures that are there are hugely important. There's so many at this stage, it's hard to digest all of them. But those are the pieces that we need to hang on to, the relevant bits that will actually touch our daily lives, so that we can understand what is the direction of travel, what is the possibility, when can I choose, how can I choose, and let me choose to go forward in that. And that's at the local level, the individual level, the household level.
Elina, would you like to say something about how we can get social acceptance for the changes that are needed?
Thanks. A really, really pertinent question. And I think that's something that we've been thinking about a lot as policymakers and regulators in the Commission. Nobody can forget the yellow vests that kind of took to the forefront of public attention in France some years back. just transition, social exclusion, and how can we make sure that citizens not only remain supportive but feel included in the process are going to be key questions at EU level but also internationally. So, as you know, the transition to net zero should not be underestimated in its magnitude. We are going to be altering pretty radically and irreversibly the way we produce, consume, and do business in this world. And if we're successful, the society is going to look entirely different from what we see today. There are going to be jobs, sectors, and industry that will no longer remain relevant. And that means that we need to really up our efforts to reskill, to upskill, and to build a society that's agile and responsive to the changes ahead of us. So at the end of the day, it is about finding jobs and opportunities and affordable and attainable alternatives for consumption, for production, that make the art of possible a reality for the citizen, but reality also for the businesses without compromising the values. I also think one of the things that we as individuals and as nations need to think about is what is of value. Is it of value to travel abroad 10 times a year with a low-cost carrier, or is it more value for us? What are the trade-offs that we're making in our everyday life? And that conversation has to start from education, awareness raising, and also availing information that allows consumers and producers, businesses to make the right choices. That's why transparency is so key. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank our two panelists very, very much for all their insights today. I'd like to also thank Noelle O'Connell and her colleagues in European Movement Ireland for helping us to make this event a reality. Our next event will be on the Conference on the Future of Europe on the 13th of December. This event will be following the discussion by the citizens panels who are meeting in Dublin at the beginning of December. So it will be a very lively and interesting discussion. And I just want to end with an apology to Father Sean Healy, as we had inadvertently scheduled this event at the same time as his annual social policy conference, Social Rights for All. So for those of you who are signed up to his event, I would encourage you to please join it now. And he's a very good lineup also from the Commission as well for that event. So thank you all very much. I hope you enjoyed this event and found it very interesting and useful, as I did. And I wish you all a nice afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.